When the Japanese soldiers first met the American Marines in the jungles of Guadalcanal in 1942, something changed in their understanding of war. Until then, they had faced Chinese troops, colonial forces, and underprepared Allied garrisons across the Pacific. But the Marines were different. They were not the largest army, nor the most heavily equipped. Yet the Japanese soon learned that this small, stubborn group of men would fight until nothing was left standing. The night was heavy with humidity, the sound of insects and the distant crash of the ocean mixing with the whispers of soldiers moving through the dark. Japanese units crept toward the American perimeter, confident and experienced from years of fighting across Asia. They believed the enemy would break as others had. But when the first shots erupted from the jungle, the sound of disciplined automatic fire cut through the night like lightning. It wasn't random. It was controlled. It was professional. By dawn, the ground was littered with bodies. The Japanese were stunned to find that the Marines had held their positions through repeated assaults. No fear in their eyes, no retreat. Only steady, cold efficiency. One survivor later wrote in his diary that, "These Americans fight like demons." It was not admiration. It was the beginning of hatred, born from fear and disbelief that anyone could match their fanatic resolve. The Pacific War was unlike any other theater. The terrain itself was the first enemy. Thick jungle, heat, disease, mud, and endless rain stripped away every illusion of glory. For the Japanese soldier, trained under the code of Bushido and raised in a system that praised death before surrender, the Marines represented an insult to that code. These men fought brutally, but they fought to live. They did not die for an emperor, they fought for each other. And that made them unpredictable, harder to break. At Guadalcanal, the Japanese launched assault after assault across the Matanico River and through the dense coconut groves. Each time they believed the Marines would be crushed. But each time they were met with fierce resistance, artillery, and precise rifle fire. The Marines were not faster or stronger, but they were organized. Their communication, their support, their discipline, all worked together like a single living machine. The Japanese came from an army that saw individual sacrifice as the highest virtue. The Marines came from a corps that valued teamwork above all else. When a Japanese officer fell, his men often fought blindly, charging into death. When a Marine officer fell, someone else took his place instantly. The system itself kept fighting. This difference, more than any weapon, made the Marines a nightmare opponent for the Japanese command. By early 1943, reports reached Tokyo describing the American Marines as tenacious beyond expectation. Some officers dismissed these claims, insisting that their soldiers simply lacked faith. Others, those who had faced them directly, knew better. The hatred grew, not because of propaganda but because the Marines kept standing where everyone else had fallen. On Tarawa, the hatred became something deeper. The island was a fortress, defended by over 4,000 Japanese troops who had sworn to kill 10 Americans each before dying. When the Marines landed in November 1943, the tides betrayed them. Many landing craft stuck on the coral reefs, leaving the men to wade hundreds of meters through open fire. They were slaughtered by machine guns, artillery, and snipers. Yet hour after hour more Marines came. Some crawled through the water with rifles above their heads, some dragged wounded men through the surf. By nightfall the beach was red. But the Marines did not retreat. They fought forward, yard by yard, in one of the bloodiest battles in American history. Japanese defenders who survived the first night realized that these men were not invaders seeking glory, they were relentless. They refused to stop. For the Japanese mindset, it was incomprehensible. Letters recovered from dead Japanese soldiers spoke of disbelief. They keep coming. Even when their bodies burned, they move forward. The hatred became fear, and fear turned to respect, though no one would admit it openly. For the Marines, the experience was equally horrifying. The Japanese fought to the death, refused to surrender, and sometimes feigned death only to detonate grenades among their captors. It was not hatred that drove the Marines, it was survival. But the Japanese saw this determination as something monstrous. Both sides began to see the other as less than human. Each encounter deepened that perception. For Japanese soldiers taught that Americans were weak and soft, seeing them charge through machine gun fire shattered their illusions. For Marines who found mutilated bodies of their comrades, hatred was born from pain and revenge. Yet underneath that, in the darkest hours of night, when the fighting stopped and the jungle went silent, there were moments when soldiers on both sides listened to the cries of the wounded, enemy and ally alike, and felt the same human fear, the same loneliness, the same wish that it would end. The hatred between the Japanese and American Marines was not just military. It was psychological. The Japanese viewed surrender as disgraceful, The Marines saw survival as duty. The result was a collision of two moral systems that could not coexist. As the war moved toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese High Command issued new orders. The Americans are beasts. Kill them all. But the troops who had fought the Marines knew that these words were lies of comfort. They had seen the faces of their enemies, not beasts but men who refused to die. And that refusal haunted them. At Guadalcanal, the Japanese launched assault after assault across the Matanico River and through the dense coconut groves. Each time they believed the Marines would be crushed. But each time they were met with fierce resistance, artillery and precise rifle fire. The Marines were not faster or stronger, but they were organized. Their communication, their support, their discipline, all worked together like a single living machine. The Japanese came from an army that saw individual sacrifice as the highest virtue. The Marines came from a corps that valued teamwork above all else. When a Japanese officer fell, his men often fought blindly, charging into death. When a Marine officer fell, someone else took his place instantly. The system itself kept fighting. This difference, more than any weapon, made the Marines a nightmare opponent for the Japanese command. By early 1943, reports reached Tokyo describing the American Marines as tenacious beyond expectation. Some officers dismissed these claims, insisting that their soldiers simply lacked faith. Others, those who had faced them directly, knew better. The hatred grew, not because of propaganda but because the Marines kept standing where everyone else had fallen. On Tarawa, the hatred became something deeper. The island was a fortress, defended by over 4,000 Japanese troops who had sworn to kill 10 Americans each before dying. When the Marines landed in November 1943, the tides betrayed them. Many landing craft stuck on the coral reefs, leaving the men to wade hundreds of meters through open fire. They were slaughtered by machine guns, artillery, and snipers. Yet hour after hour more Marines came. Some crawled through the water with rifles above their heads, some dragged wounded men through the surf. By nightfall the beach was red. But the Marines did not retreat. They fought forward, yard by yard, in one of the bloodiest battles in American history. Japanese defenders who survived the first night realized that these men were not invaders seeking glory. They were relentless. They refused to stop. For the Japanese mindset, it was incomprehensible. Letters recovered from dead Japanese soldiers spoke of disbelief. They keep coming. Even when their bodies burned, they move forward. The hatred became fear, and fear turned to respect, though no one would admit it openly. For the Marines, the experience was equally horrifying. The Japanese fought to the death, refused to surrender, and sometimes feigned death only to detonate grenades among their captors. It was not hatred that drove the Marines, it was survival. But the Japanese saw this determination as something monstrous. Both sides began to see the other as less than human. Each encounter deepened that perception. For Japanese soldiers taught that Americans were weak and soft, seeing them charge through machine gun fire shattered their illusions. For Marines who found mutilated bodies of their comrades, hatred was born from pain and revenge. Yet underneath that, in the darkest hours of night, when the fighting stopped and the jungle went silent, there were moments when soldiers on both sides listened to the cries of the wounded, enemy and ally alike, and felt the same human fear, the same loneliness, the same wish that it would end. The hatred between the Japanese and American Marines was not just military. It was psychological. The Japanese viewed surrender as disgraceful. The Marines saw survival as duty. The result was a collision of two moral systems that could not coexist. As the war moved toward Iwo Jima and Okinawa, the Japanese High Command issued new orders. The Americans are beasts. Kill them all. But the troops who had fought the Marines knew that these words were lies of comfort. They had seen the faces of their enemies, not beasts but men who refused to die. And that refusal haunted them. Guadalcanal was the turning point. It taught the Japanese that the war would not end quickly. It showed them that the American Marines were not afraid to suffer. By the time the island was lost, nearly 25,000 Japanese had been killed or left to starve. Few surrendered. The Marines buried their own dead quietly and kept moving forward. War reporters described the Marines as quiet professionals. They did not celebrate. They did not shout. They buried their comrades and looked across the battlefield with blank eyes. For the Japanese, who celebrated death as honor, this quiet endurance was unnerving. When Japanese propaganda called them devils, it wasn't only an insult, it was an explanation. The only way to justify being defeated by such men was to deny their humanity. But among officers who survived, there was another understanding. These men were dangerous because they believed in something real, each other. The hatred, therefore, was mixed with fear and fear with admiration. On Tarawa, Japanese officers noted that Marines treated their wounded even under fire. They value life, one diary said. They protect their dead. That was something alien to men who had been taught that their own lives were expendable. Each battle that followed, Saipan, Polilliu, Iwo Jima, reinforced this divide. The Japanese were fighting ghosts who would not stop coming. The Marines were fighting shadows who refused to surrender. Behind all of it was the machinery of two nations that had lost control of their humanity. For every victory there were thousands of broken lives. For every inch of land, there were mothers, fathers, and children waiting on both sides of the ocean. The Marines did not hate the Japanese because of who they were. They hated what the war forced them to become. And deep down some Japanese soldiers felt the same. War strips away the illusion of difference. In the mud of Guadalcanal they were all the same, hungry, afraid, and far from home. But it would take years and hundreds of thousands more deaths before either side would see that truth clearly. By 1944, the Japanese command began preparing for what they knew would be the end. Their soldiers wrote farewell letters, buried family photos, and waited for death. The Marines loaded their rifles, knowing they would face men who no longer cared to live. In the distance, ships burned across the horizon, their silhouettes glowing against the Pacific sky. The war that had begun with pride was now only about endurance. And in that endurance, the Japanese hatred toward the Marines burned brightest, because in them they saw the reflection of themselves, disciplined, unyielding, and doomed. By the time the Marines reached the black sands of Iwo Jima in February 1945, the hatred and fear that had built between the two forces had reached its peak. The Japanese had transformed the island into a fortress of tunnels, bunkers, and hidden artillery. They were ordered to die there. Every soldier understood he was not expected to return. They had food and ammunition for months, but no hope of rescue. Above them, the American fleet filled the horizon, thousands of guns pounding the earth day and night. The Marines were coming again, and the Japanese knew exactly who they were. The bombardment lasted for days. The ground shook like a living thing, fire and smoke swallowing the island whole. Yet when the Marines finally landed, the silence was eerie. There was no enemy waiting on the beaches. Only the smell of sulfur and the black sand that swallowed boots and slowed movement. Then, at the moment when confusion turned into tension, the volcano came alive. Japanese machine guns and mortars opened from every direction. The Marines fell by the hundreds in the first minutes, pinned to the ground with nowhere to hide. The men of the 28th Marine Regiment, pushing toward Mount Suribachi, described the feeling as fighting ghosts inside a nightmare. The enemy was invisible but everywhere. Each cave held death. Each rock could explode without warning. The Japanese had learned not to waste men in open attacks. Now they fought like the Marines, coordinated, disciplined, determined to drag the Americans into hell with them. But the Marines kept coming. Inch by inch, yard by yard, under fire that would have broken most armies. When one man fell, another picked up his weapon. Flamethrowers roared through tunnels and grenades echoed endlessly underground. It was not just courage. It was training, unity, and the refusal to stop moving forward. Japanese soldiers trapped inside their bunkers heard the steady sound of boots above them, the voices of men who did not retreat even when surrounded by death. They wrote in diaries found later, "They do not fear death. They move through fire as if it is nothing." Some wrote prayers. Others wrote curses. Many never finished writing at all. The hatred of the Marines came from this relentlessness. The Japanese understood fighting men who were afraid, who broke, who surrendered. But they could not understand these Americans who refused to die quietly. The Bushido Code had taught that courage was found only in sacrifice. Yet the Marines proved that courage could also live in endurance, in staying alive, in pulling your wounded brother out of the fire, in holding ground when every instinct told you to run. When the Marines raised the flag on Mount Suribachi, it was not a moment of triumph in the way history later painted it. For the men who survived, it was exhaustion, grief, and disbelief that they were still alive. Below them, Japanese soldiers still fought and died in the tunnels. The battle continued for weeks after that photograph was taken. Letters recovered later from Japanese officers told the same story: "We cannot stop them. They fight as we do, but for a different reason. That reason the Japanese could never fully understand. They fought for the emperor, the Marines fought for the man beside them. One soldier's survival depended entirely on the other's trust, and that made them unstoppable as a unit." The hatred grew darker in the battle for Okinawa. It was no longer just about honor or discipline. It became desperation. The Japanese army, already starved and depleted, threw everything it had left into the defense of that island. soldiers, civilians, even children. The Americans called it the Typhoon of Steel, and it consumed both sides. The Marines had learned the lessons of every battle before. They moved carefully, methodically, using flamethrowers and tanks to root out defenders from caves and cliffs. To the Japanese it looked like an army of machines, not men. Every explosion, every movement, calculated and merciless. For Japanese soldiers hiding in the hills, this was no longer war. It was extermination. They saw their comrades die by fire and shrapnel, their strongholds collapsing, their officers gone. The only thing left to hold on to was hatred of the men who would not fall, who advanced even when surrounded by death. But even as the hatred burned, some began to question. One diary found after the battle read, "They bury our dead. They share water with prisoners. They call their wounded brother. We were told they were beasts, but beasts do not show mercy." By then the Japanese command had forbidden surrender entirely. Any soldier captured was branded a traitor. So most chose to die. Yet many Japanese began to understand that the Marines, for all their brutality, were human. And that understanding was unbearable. To see humanity in the enemy meant seeing the futility of their own sacrifice. The Marines, too, suffered more than anyone outside the war could imagine. Rain fell for weeks, turning the ground into a swamp of rot and corpses. The smell of death clung to everything. Young men aged in days. They stopped talking. They stopped caring about glory or medals. All they wanted was for it to end. At night, both sides heard the screams. The Marines called in artillery on hills they could barely see. The Japanese charged with bayonets, not to win but to die standing. And when dawn came, the survivors crawled among the dead, searching for canteens of water, rifles that still worked, or letters that could never be sent. By June 1945, Okinawa was lost. Over 100,000 Japanese soldiers were dead, along with tens of thousands of civilians. The Marines had taken the island, but at a cost so high that no one could call it victory. The hatred that once drove the Japanese had been replaced by emptiness. Their last letters spoke not of the emperor but of their families. "I hope my mother will not cry too long," one wrote. Another simply said, "Forgive me." And the Marines, those men the Japanese once saw as demons, began to feel something different too. They saw the faces of enemy dead, boys barely older than themselves, and the illusion of righteousness started to fade. They realized the enemy they had killed could have been any one of them, if they had been born on another island, under another flag. As the war reached its final months, the Japanese High Command prepared for an invasion of the home islands. They trained civilians to fight with bamboo spears, schoolgirls to carry grenades. They promised that 100 million hearts would beat as one for the emperor. But the soldiers who had faced the Marines on Iwo Jima and Okinawa knew better. They knew that when the Americans landed, there would be nothing left to defend. Those men did not hate the Marines anymore. They feared them. And beneath that fear was a strange, quiet respect, the kind that exists only between enemies who have seen each other's souls. When Japan finally surrendered after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, many Marines wept. Not from joy but from relief. The killing was over. They could finally go home. And somewhere in Japan, men who had once sworn to die fighting them looked at the sky and thought the same. The hatred that had defined the war dissolved into silence. But the memory stayed. For the rest of their lives, those who survived, on both sides, would dream of jungle heat, of black sand, of the faces of men who never came home. War, they understood at last, had never been about victory or defeat. It had been about endurance, pain, and loss. The Japanese had hated the Marines because they mirrored their own will to fight, their own refusal to surrender. And seeing that reflection was unbearable. The Pacific War left no heroes, only survivors. The hatred that began in the jungles of Guadalcanal ended on the beaches of Okinawa, buried beneath ash and ocean wind. In its place remained only the truth that both sides had paid the same price, and that in war no one ever truly wins. By the end of 1944, the Pacific was a graveyard. The war had burned through jungles, swallowed islands, and broken armies. The Japanese Empire, once confident in its divine mission, was collapsing under the weight of its own belief. The Marines had become the symbol of that collapse, not just because they won battles but because they kept returning, unstoppable like the tide. In Tokyo, generals still spoke of glory and sacrifice. They told their people that the Americans were weak, that they hid behind machines and numbers. But soldiers who had faced the Marines at Tarawa, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima knew the truth. They had seen Americans charge through open fire, crawl through mud, and keep fighting even when their units were almost destroyed. That knowledge spread quietly among the troops, whispered in bunkers, written in secret letters home that never made it past censors. Many Japanese soldiers could not reconcile what they had been taught with what they had witnessed. The Bushido Code demanded purity of purpose and the total rejection of fear. But when they met the Marines, they saw an enemy who was fearless in a different way. The Americans were not seeking death, they fought to survive. And somehow that made them even more terrifying. On Poliliu, the Japanese garrison commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had built an intricate system of caves and bunkers to bleed the Americans dry. He expected the Marines to fall apart under the heat, thirst, and exhaustion. Instead, the Marines adapted. They moved in small squads, coordinated by radio, covering each other with machine gun fire and grenades. It was a brutal, methodical war, one that consumed both sides inch by inch. Nakagawa's men fought until almost none remained. When the colonel finally committed suicide as custom demanded, he left behind a final message. We fought the enemy as best we could. They are strong and unyielding. Tell the emperor that we did not surrender. In the diaries of Japanese soldiers captured afterward, a different tone appeared. They never stop, one wrote. Even when the sun burns the ground and we hear their dead crying in the dark, they come again. They are like waves. The hatred that once burned like fire had turned into something colder, a recognition that they were facing men just as determined to die, though for reasons they could not comprehend. For the Japanese, this realization was unbearable, because it stripped away the moral superiority their leaders had promised them. The Marines were not fighting for conquest. They were fighting because they had been told they must. They fought for survival, for comrades, and for a country that most of them barely understood. They fought because the alternative was to die. And the Japanese, raised in a culture that glorified death, could not understand the strength in choosing life. The Pacific Islands became testing grounds for that difference in philosophy. On Saipan, thousands of Japanese civilians, terrified by propaganda that the Americans would torture or enslave them, jumped from cliffs with their children rather than surrender. The Marines, helpless to stop them, watched in horror. Some screamed, begging them not to jump. Others turned away, broken by what they saw. Those who survived told how the Marines gave water to enemy prisoners, carried the wounded, and treated civilians with care. For Japanese soldiers hiding in the caves, hearing those stories from refugees shattered everything they had been told. The enemy they had been ordered to hate was showing humanity. Still, the hatred lingered because it was easier than shame. To admit that the enemy had honor was to admit that everything they had died for might have been a lie. For the Marines, hatred had also become a kind of shield. The atrocities, the booby traps, the suicides, all of it hardened them. They stopped seeing the Japanese as people. They became ghosts in each other's nightmares. The Marines burned caves without hesitation because hesitation meant death. The Japanese killed themselves rather than be taken, because surrender meant disgrace. There was no mercy left on either side. And yet, beneath that, an unspoken respect began to grow. It was not spoken aloud, but it existed in the way Marines stopped firing when the last bunker went silent, or in the way Japanese soldiers, before dying, faced their enemy with a kind of grim acknowledgement. The Marines had been trained to destroy, but many of them left the islands with questions they would never be able to answer. They had seen the faces of men who had fought just as hard, who had prayed, who had loved, and who had died believing they were right. In one of the Marine field reports from Poliliu, a line was scribbled in pencil: "We fought men who did not fear death. But maybe they were afraid of something else, living after losing." The Japanese had built their empire on the idea that death in service was the highest honor. The Marines, through their endurance, proved that survival could be just as noble. That clash of beliefs became the core of the hatred between them, not simple animosity, but the anger that comes from seeing your reflection in an enemy you were told to despise. When the Marines moved from one island to the next, they carried with them not just their weapons but their memories. They knew what awaited them: heat, death, ambushes, and an enemy who would rather burn than yield. They no longer imagined themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as men caught in a storm that no one could stop. For the Japanese, the arrival of the Marines meant the end. Every island taken meant another step closer to the homeland. Their hatred became desperation, their courage a kind of resignation. They fought not to win but to die well. The Marines fought not to die, but to finish what they had begun. The two forces were bound together by the same tragedy, young men sent to kill each other for reasons far beyond their understanding. They had different gods, different flags, different languages, but the fear in their eyes was the same. When survivors of both sides met years later, during memorial ceremonies, they often spoke of those moments without bitterness. Some Japanese veterans said they had hated the Marines because they envied them, their supplies, their unity, their ability to laugh even in war. Some Marines admitted they respected their enemy's discipline, his refusal to quit. The hatred had long since faded, leaving only memory and sorrow. The Pacific War became a story not of good versus evil, but of endurance versus destruction. The Marines were forged by it, but they were also scarred. They had learned to fight in conditions no human should endure, and to face an enemy who, in the end, was a mirror of their own will. The hatred that once defined the battles of Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima was no longer about race or nation. It was about survival, about men trapped between two ideals, each unable to understand the other's way of courage. As the war neared its end, the Japanese soldiers who still lived dug deeper into their caves, waiting for the inevitable. They no longer wrote about victory. They wrote about peace. One letter found after the war read, "The Marines are coming again. I wish to see my home once more, but I will die here. Tell my mother the enemy fought well." In that final line, buried under layers of fear and pride, there was truth, the kind of truth that survives after hatred burns itself out. By the summer of 1945, the world had begun to collapse under the weight of its own destruction. The Pacific was silent in some places and still burning in others. The Marines who had survived Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Polilliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa were no longer young men. Their eyes had changed. They had seen too much death to believe in glory. They fought because there was no other choice left, and because the men beside them expected them to. On the other side, the Japanese army had become a shadow of what it once was. Hunger ruled the islands. Ammunition was scarce. Disease spread faster than commands could be given. Yet the hatred toward the Marines still burned, not because of ideology anymore, but because they had become the face of the inevitable. Every time the Japanese saw the rising sun fade into gunfire and smoke, they knew the Marines were near. The same disciplined enemy, moving with precision, backed by thunder from the sea and sky. When the Americans landed on Okinawa, it was no longer a question of who would win. Everyone knew. The only question left was how many would die before it ended. The Japanese commanders ordered civilians to fight, to die, to sacrifice. Leaflets and broadcasts warned that the Marines would kill everyone. And yet, when the Marines reached villages, many of those same civilians found themselves handed food, water, and medical care. It was a small act of humanity in a place where humanity had almost vanished. For Japanese soldiers watching this, the confusion was unbearable. They had been told the Marines were demons, invaders without compassion. But they were seeing the opposite. Men who, even in war, refused to cross certain lines. It was easier to hate an enemy who was cruel. Harder to hate one who showed mercy. The hatred began to crumble from within. The soldiers in the caves, surrounded and hopeless, started to whisper doubts. Was their sacrifice still honorable if the enemy treated them better than their own command? Some still fought to the death. Others hid until starvation took them. A few surrendered, trembling, expecting torture, and instead found rations, blankets, and silence. The Marines didn't speak much to them. There was nothing to say. The faces of the prisoners were thin and hollow, and in their eyes the Marines saw themselves. The same exhaustion. The same desire for it all to be over. When the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Marines were still preparing for an invasion of Japan. They had been told it would make Okinawa look small, that millions might die on both sides. The bombs ended that. The war ended suddenly in a way no one could comprehend. When the surrender was announced, there was no celebration among the Marines. They sat quietly, staring at the horizon, listening to the waves. They had spent years learning how to kill, how to survive, how to hate. Now all at once they were being told to stop. Many couldn't. The sound of gunfire still echoed in their dreams. The faces of the dead still came when they closed their eyes. For the Japanese, surrender was not peace. It was humiliation. Entire generations had been taught that surrender was worse than death. But for those who had fought the Marines, there was a strange kind of relief mixed with shame. They had seen enough to understand that death for its own sake was empty. The Marines had shown them that. In the months after the war, when American occupation began, many Japanese expected revenge. Instead, they found Marines standing guard on their streets, helping distribute food, rebuilding roads, keeping order. These were the same men they had once called monsters. Now they were rebuilding what the war had destroyed. One Japanese officer, writing in his post-war memoirs, said, "I could not hate them anymore. They were enemies only when they had to be. Now they were simply men doing their duty." For the Marines, returning to Japan was surreal. They walked through the ruins of cities, through places where their bombs had fallen, and they saw what the war had done to ordinary people. They saw children scavenging for food, old men bowing out of fear, and women who had lost everything. Many Marines gave away their rations, quietly, without orders. It was not pity. It was the instinct of men who understood suffering. Some Japanese civilians, seeing this, wept. Not because of charity, but because it shattered the last illusion that had fueled their hatred. The enemy had become human again. In the years that followed, when peace replaced destruction, a strange bond formed between the two nations. Former enemies became allies. American Marines returned to Japan as trainers, diplomats, and friends. Veterans met on battlefields turned memorials. They shook hands. Some bowed. Others simply stood in silence. Those meetings were not about forgiveness. They were about recognition, the quiet understanding that both sides had been used by forces larger than themselves. They had fought each other fiercely, but for reasons neither fully chose. Many Japanese veterans admitted that their hatred of the Marines had been born out of fear. Fear of losing, fear of facing an enemy who could not be broken. The Marines, in turn, admitted that the Japanese had earned their respect the hard way, through courage that defied understanding. Historians later wrote that the Pacific War had been one of the most brutal in history, not because of cruelty alone, but because of the collision of two cultures that could not comprehend each other's morality. For the Japanese, death was the proof of loyalty. For the Marines, survival was the proof of strength. When those two ideas met, there was no middle ground. And yet, from that destruction, a kind of peace emerged. The Japanese learned to rebuild not through conquest, but through resilience. The Marines, too, carried lessons home, that courage has many faces and that hatred, once born, consumes everything it touches. In the decades after the war, survivors spoke to schoolchildren, to filmmakers, to historians. Some cried when they spoke. Others said nothing, letting the silence speak for them. The Japanese who had once hated the Marines most often said the same words. They fought with honor. That acknowledgement meant more than victory ever could. Because it meant that even after everything, the death, the fear, the fire, humanity had survived. The Marines, too, never forgot. Many visited the graves of Japanese soldiers. They placed flowers. Some prayed. Some just stood there, remembering the faces of boys they had killed, realizing that hatred had achieved nothing. Time does not erase war. It only dulls its edges. But among those who truly lived it, the memory of their enemy often became the measure of their own humanity. And so the story of why the Japanese hated fighting American Marines more than any other unit is not simply about combat or tactics. It is about what happens when two worlds collide, one built on death as duty, the other on life as obligation, and how, in the end, both learned the same truth, that war consumes everything and leaves only sorrow in its wake. The war ended, but the silence that followed was not peace. It was an echo of everything left unsaid. The Pacific lay still, holding the ghosts of thousands who had vanished beneath its waves. On the islands, the jungles began to grow back, swallowing the ruins of bunkers and airfields, hiding the bones of men who had once fought there. The hatred that had burned between the Japanese and the American Marines dissolved into the soil, leaving behind a quiet reminder of what it had cost both sides to learn that lesson. 4 years after 1945, survivors on both sides struggled to live with what they had seen. Many Japanese veterans refused to speak about the war at all. They carried their guilt like a shadow. The guilt of surviving when so many had not, the guilt of realizing that their enemies had been men no different from themselves. The Marines, too, carried their silence. They came home to parades, but inside, the noise of battle never stopped. The smell of smoke, the sound of screams, the sight of faces disappearing into fire, all of it stayed like scars beneath the skin. The hatred that once made them fight without hesitation had nowhere to go. It had served its purpose. It had kept them alive. But in peace, it became poison. And so they buried it deep, speaking instead of duty, of brotherhood, of the men they lost. When the first reunions between Japanese and American veterans took place decades later, they were hesitant, awkward, and filled with unspoken emotion. Old men stood before each other, men who had once tried to kill one another, and found no anger left. They bowed, they shook hands, and sometimes they cried. One Marine veteran said, "We both did what we had to do. We were young. Now we understand." That understanding did not come easily. It came from memory, from the nights when both sides had waited for death and thought about home. From the shared knowledge that war strips away everything except what is most human: fear, loyalty, and the desire to live. Historians have often asked why the Japanese soldiers hated fighting the Marines more than any other enemy. The answer is simple but painful. The Marines refused to die the way the Japanese expected them to. They refused to be broken. They fought with the same courage, the same devotion, and the same discipline that the Japanese had believed belonged only to themselves. To see that reflected in the enemy was unbearable. Every battle with the Marines forced the Japanese to confront their own humanity and their own doubt. When a Marine charged through fire or carried a wounded comrade under machine gun bursts, it showed that honor could live without ritual and courage could exist without sacrifice. That realization shattered the foundation of everything they had been taught. Hatred became the only way to hide the truth. For the Marines, hatred was simpler. It was the armor that let them survive. The Japanese fought with a kind of madness: suicide charges, hidden bombs, surrender that turned into death. The Marines learned not to trust anything that moved. To live, they had to harden their hearts. But even then there were moments, small, quiet moments, when that armor cracked. A dying Japanese soldier clutching a photo of his family. A Marine lowering his rifle because he saw tears instead of rage. Those moments didn't change the outcome of battles. But they changed the men who lived through them. Years later, many would say they didn't fight the Japanese people. They fought the war itself. In time, Japan rebuilt. Cities rose from ashes. The same discipline and resilience that had once fueled its soldiers now rebuilt its factories, its schools, its future. The Marines who once fought there returned decades later as allies, walking through clean streets filled with life, hearing laughter instead of gunfire. Yet in the hearts of those who remembered, the war never really ended. It lived in their silence, in the way they looked at the sea, in the way they told their grandchildren that war was not glory, it was loss. Some of the old Japanese soldiers who had fought on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, or Iwo Jima spent their final years visiting the graves of their fallen comrades. Others sent flowers to American cemeteries on the same islands. They never said why. They didn't have to. The gesture said everything, that the hatred had died but the memory must remain. The Marines too grew old. Their stories filled museums, books, and films, but the men themselves rarely spoke of what they had done. They had fought the most disciplined and determined enemy they had ever faced. They knew that in some terrible way that enemy had helped define who they were. The respect was mutual, born in blood and silence. And so, when people today ask why the Japanese hated fighting the Marines more than any other unit, the answer lies not in military reports or propaganda, but in the human heart. Because the Marines forced them to see that courage was not theirs alone. Because the Marines fought not for an emperor, not for conquest, but for each other. And because in those moments when death seemed certain, both sides looked across the battlefield and saw themselves. In the end, hatred fades. What remains is understanding that war has no heroes, only survivors. That every victory carries a graveyard's weight. That the true enemy was never the man across the field, but the idea that killing could ever lead to peace. The Pacific is quiet now. The waves roll softly over the same beaches that once ran red with blood. Children play where soldiers once fell. Time has washed away the noise but not the memory. The wind that passes through the palms still carries whispers of those who fought and died, of the voices that once shouted across the smoke and flame. They say the ocean remembers everything. If you stand long enough on the shores of Iwo Jima or Okinawa, you can feel it, the pulse of history under your feet, the heartbeat of men who believed they were enemies, and who died learning they were the same. And maybe that is what the story has always been trying to say, that courage without compassion is just endurance, and hatred without reason is just fear wearing armor. That the only way to honor the dead is to remember what they learned too late. That war is not the measure of strength, but the proof of how fragile we are. So when you hear the waves, remember them, the Japanese soldiers who fought with devotion, and the Marines who fought with duty. Remember the islands, the faces, the silence after the battle. Remember that they were all human. Because in the end, that is the truth that outlives every war. And if you've listened this far, if their story reached you, don't let it end here. Subscribe for more historical documentaries like this one, and watch the next episode, where we continue uncovering the untold human stories behind the wars that shaped our world. Because history only lives as long as we remember.